This video's topic is going to be interesting. Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to my channel. So I don't usually talk about such things, and this is not the main topic of my channel, or to be exact, it only partially relates to my channel since I talk about books most of the time. However, I decided to address this topic. It's about literary criticism. While I did write down some of my thoughts, most of this video is going to go unscripted, and I'm simply going to address my own thoughts on the matter. This isn't an analysis of the history of literary criticism and today's form or whatever. I just wanna speak my mind on literary criticism. I also want to use literary criticism as an excuse to speak about certain genres and the reputation certain genres and also books and authors they have. So this is kind of a spontaneous video. My thoughts might be not so coherent. This isn't a video essay. Video essays are mostly scripted and detailed or whatever, and I'm simply ranting on the camera, so let's go. A lot of people have heard about the term literary criticism. In this video, I'm going to talk about whether we need literary criticism in 2025 and in years to come. That's because the definition of literary criticism has changed over the years, I guess. But allow me to answer the question, do we need literary criticism in 2025? Short answer, both yes and no. Yes, we both need and do not need literary criticism. Let's elaborate. Why do we need literary criticism? Well, I'd like to start by saying that I think that people have a very misguided idea of what literary criticism actually is. People think that criticizing books means that pointing out the book's flaws and pointing out what was written wrong or whatever. While this isn't entirely wrong, there's more to the picture than simply that. Literary criticism is one of the reasons we have English degrees, literature degrees, or degrees like that. We need literary criticism because literary criticism isn't simply about talking what's wrong with the book. It's also analyzing the text and the context. When I say we need literary criticism, we need it to analyze classics for most of the time, because I'm gonna say something absolutely shocking. I think a lot of people wouldn't like to hear this, and I'm going to say this. A lot of classic novels, not all of them, let me elaborate from the beginning, not all of them, let me say, but a lot of classic novels are unreadable without the context. So in schools, in any country, you have some mandatory reading, and I have a very controversial opinion that if there's mandatory reading, a literary canon or whatever, if there are books that kids are required to read at schools, then so should be the explanation of the context. A lot of classic books are kind of difficult. They aren't necessarily easy to read for a lot of people, and this is why we need literary critics, because they also analyze the text, they explain the context, and they explain what the author meant here and there. Well, most of them. Okay, I do realize that literary criticism isn't just about classics, it's about other types of books too. However, classics is the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear the words literary criticism. And here is also one thing that a lot of people probably do not realize about classics. This also explains why we need literary critics. Books that enter literary canon, they aren't selected because they are well written. They aren't selected because people resonate with the book. Literary canon isn't even shaped due to commercial success, and not because the books are vindicated by history. Literary canon, regardless of country or historical period, is selected as a way to create an identity for the country. And not even all books from the classic period were selected. The books that were selected, they were selected because they represented a correct ideology, or sometimes because the authors aligned with the correct narrative. Well, which narrative is correct is up to debate, but that's not the point of the video. The point is that the books weren't selected as their own thing, they were a tool. And a lot of books from the literary canon, yeah, they come with that context and it's inseparable from the books. And I think that literature classes, well, probably in any country, do a huge disservice to the students when they try to separate the context from the books. And to this day, the list remains the same, even though the ideology is long gone. I do have unpopular opinions regarding this. Context is absolutely mandatory, it should be studied. I'm not in deep, and I'm not mean into the literature degree type of deep. I mean that the basics of the context should be studied regarding the books. And I think that literary canon should be questioned. Who decided that these books were the greatest books ever written? Why? Why this and not that book? Why can't the literary canon be expanded? Well, because if the classic literature is about representing a particular time period, then modern literature does the same. It reflects the current period, and therefore in the future it should be in the canon. And this is one of the reasons I absolutely dislike the contemporary versus classic discourse, because it's not beneficial to anyone. I do not think that it benefits anybody. I think it's hurtful. I think it's unnecessary. You can't classics and contemporary literature fight each other or something like that, because if there is an evolution of literature, the modern literature, contemporary fiction represents that, and in the future it should be studied as a representation of a current time period. Now when I think about it, I would learn the literary canon if it included the context. But no, they force the kids to read these difficult novels without explaining anything, and when they do not understand anything, they say like, oh, you are not mature enough to understand this, you lack life experience, and yada yada yada. And that's counterproductive. If grown adults say such things, then what does it say about them? If kids are forced to read these books, do not understand anything and hate reading, and then adults lash out, then it says more about adults than the kids. Because at least the kids will grow and learn and understand things, and they have everything ahead. Yeah, I do confess that this thinking that you are supposed to read these mandatory serious works, otherwise you are not a serious reader or whatever, it pushed me towards Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and while I like the book, well, despite being pressured to read it, I still was selective, because I can combine the pressure and the selection. aka I can be required to read a classic book and I can still select it. So within the frames of this is mandatory, I can still be selective. And I'm glad that I read it in 2017, because it wouldn't fly today. Because nowadays I wouldn't pick a book up just because it's a mandatory reading, or because this makes you look smart or whatever. Right after university ended, I was like, no, that I'm done. I'm out. I'm reading whatever I want. And that has been the case for 5 years already. Now it's 2025 and I started in 2020. And what does this have to do with literary criticism, you ask me? Well, what it has to do with literary criticism is, like I said, it analyzes the context, the text itself, and helps people understand the classics. And solid literary critics, they do not insult others. They do not call people not mature enough, stupid, or whatever, or insult contemporary literature. They do not do such things. Because valid literary criticism includes the explanation and analysis of the context. I think that everywhere there is this question: what did the author mean with this? What did the author wanted to say? Well, given the context, here is the honest answer about what the author actually wanted to say. Here's brutally honest version that I wrote down here. Point 1. I lived during political repressions and censorships. I wasn't allowed to criticize the government or an ideology, otherwise I'd be in prison or dead. No criticism or even explanations of themes whatsoever. This is why I had to write in a way that seems innocent at the first sight. But once you look closer, you will see social commentary. Yeah, this is why context matters, because some writers, they lived during difficult times, censorships and things like that, and this is why literary criticism helps explain what they try to say. They were kind of pressured to say things the way they did. Second is much more interesting. Back in my day, people didn't have Kindle Direct publishing. You had to publish your work in a newspaper, and newspapers paid you based on the amount of words in your text. This is why my books are so long. For the cash, baby. Well, that's the case with Charles Dickens, because his books are pretty long because he published them in newspapers, and the newspapers paid based on the word amount. And this is why classic books, they have so much water in the text. For those of you who do not know, in Russian language the word water is used to describe too much words in the text. So when I say water in the text, it means that way too many words. Way too simple, and I do not think you need a literary criticism for that. And also reason number 3. I am projecting my own insecurities and traumas, plain and simple. But that's interesting to analyze. And the fourth one, same as the first but the other way around. AK, the author lives in a relatively peaceful times and still wants to make a commentary, but the in-your-face commentary. I think Sally Rooney is such author. I do need to remind you that I'm not explaining just any country or any time period. This is relatable to any time in history or anywhere in the world. Okay, I do need to say something positive about classic books as books, not as the time period documents or tool for national identity or whatever. I want to say something positive about books that stand on their own. For example, we have To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. While this book deals with pretty serious topics, it's still a pretty well-written novel because you can relate to the main characters and you could read it at any moment and you will understand everything. Yes, this novel is set in a certain time period, however, a lot of themes and characters, they resonate to this day. In short, a literary criticism matters to explain the context behind the novel. And also literary critics, they can also find underrated gems. Underrated gems also matter. Probably there were books that were forgotten, and literary criticism can revive such books, because why not? Okay, here is my view of classics in general. Well, not all of the classics, of course, but still. A lot of classical novels, they are kind of like museum items. They are a window to the past. They come with a context. They come with a context, with a story, and through them you can tell a lot about society of those times. And yeah, this is why we need the classics, but for the context. And this is what makes classics relevant. I think, even if it's a controversial opinion, I do think that without the context or canonization, or if it wasn't for it being the mandatory reads, a lot of books from the literary canon would fade into obscurity. Well, before you criticize me, would you read this classic novel if it wasn't for the pressure from school and society? would you read this book that you are required to read if it wasn't required to read? And would a lot of people do the same? Now, that's a good question, and feel free to answer it in the comments. And that's not to say that classic books do not have value or are unreadable or whatever. That's not to say all classic books suck, or absolutely not, because had that been the case, my shelves would be classics free. I do absolutely believe that even within the frames of oh, you are supposed to read this, you are supposed to read that, you can still, just because something was mandatory reading, it didn't mean that I wasn't selective. Well, sure, the pressure to read certain books, it did kinda backfire. However, I do not regret reading Crime and Punishment, and at some point I'd like to read it again. I absolutely disagree with the notion that people who don't like classics do not understand them, they are actually stupid or whatever. I do realize that even outside the school, there is still pressure to read these serious books, and spoiler alert, you do not have to. You do not have to adhere to this pressure if it's not your thing. Once I realized this, I felt so free. And there's a chance that I might discover more classics I would love to read. However, I refuse to read the classics just because it makes you look good or whatever. This pressure did affect me in the past, and now I refuse to adhere to it. Yes, this is why we need literary criticism of literature, because literary criticism can be used for good. It can help you with the books, it can help you explain things, and also explain society and everything. Yeah, literary criticism matters in that matter.